Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tracy Cook, and I'm the Online Media Manager for ModernAnalyst.com, the premier community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled 4 Easy Steps to Gather, Author, Approve, and Manage Requirements. Today's featured speaker is Yuri Wallach, the Director of Product Management at Siemens Industry Software. Today's webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the question and answer session at the end. Please be sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the GoToWebinar software. I'd like to say thank you to Siemens Industry Software for sponsoring today's webinar. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Yuri Wallach. Yuri, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. For those who didn't know me, or because it's not the first time I'm doing the webinar with Modern Analyst, I'm coming from a company called Polarion that was recently acquired by Siemens Industry Software. We were delivering the products for application lifecycle management since 2004, and we provide the unified solution for requirements, coding, testing, and release management. Speaking about requirements management, the software development in general, there are several challenges we see on the market, and later when I will speak about those 4 steps, gather, author, improve, and manage requirements, we will map, some of those challenges to the way how we promote our best practices. So the first challenge we see is that the customers need to release their products more frequently. At the same time, there is increasing need for customizations. Our customers need to develop multiple versions in parallel, or at least provide the customizability options for the products. At the same time, the products are getting much more complex, but there is at the same time let's say, a need to improve the overall quality of the products. And because of that, we built our solution on top of 3 core pillars. And the first one is collaboration, traceability, and reuse. Let me just quickly highlight, what do we call by that? What do you think it's important to consider when we speak about the collaboration? If you will probably review any other vendor that delivers either requirements management or ALM solutions, every one of us is stressing the collaboration. What we believe is a little bit more, it's a differentiator on one side, but it's key in today's environment, and considering, what we see on the market is that we need to secure the collaboration. And the security doesn't really mean that the old-fashioned meaning means we don't care that much about data security. Like me as a Yuri Wallach, I cannot read some kind of confidential data. We really care more about who can change what and when. Means that we speak about requirements management, and how do we ensure that the collaboration is secured in a way that when the requirement is approved, it shouldn't be changed without notifying the other people. How can we really secure the collaboration so the impact is analyzed? And we will see later how we help with that. The second point is cross-domain traceability. It means that whenever we speak about requirements, we think that it's essential not to have the requirements isolated, but it's always important to keep them, let's say, managed in the context of the other artifacts. Sometimes the traceability is wrongly understood as just ability to link items together, like link a requirement with a test case. We think that it's less about linking, but more really about connecting the steps of a development process. So it means that instead of just linking a test case, what we deliver is a proof that the requirement was really tested. So our requirements management capabilities are unified and well integrated into the other domains like testing, like development. And the third pillar was reuse. So the statistic says that 60 to 80% of requirements, but not just requirements, also code and tests are being shared between projects, and there are different, let's say, best practices and different ways how to effectively reuse and share the data between projects. So these are the core pillars for our solutions, and now I will focus more really on those 4 steps: how to gather, author, approve, and manage requirements. And we'll start first with the gathering process, and I will try to keep it really simple today. If it will be oversimplified, please ask questions so we can go more into the details at the end of my presentation. So when speaking about gathering of requirements, very often we start speaking about the import procedure. And I think there are several aspects that you should not forget about when thinking about gathering and importing of requirements. First one is really not to lose any information on when importing the assets from for example, Microsoft Office documents into the database or repository. The second thing is that whenever you import it, you need to ensure that the results are traceable. And very often, in today's environment, you all know how Agile is become a mainstream to develop the products. It's not just, let's say, a waterfall that you import initial requirements, but you need to really enable the collaboration between the customer, between the stakeholders, and the delivery teams. So when speaking really about importing, the goal is really, or how to identify this operation is about getting unstructured data. A good example of this unstructured data is a Word document. And what's so wrong about managing the requirements just as a Word document? The number one reason what we think is essential when tracking requirements is the granularity. So there is, and I'll show it later, really an essential goal, not just to import a document as is, but make sure that every information that is in the document, initial specification, is really uniquely identifiable and traceable. So that's the first point, is take the unstructured data and import it into the system and make it structured, but in a way that you can still more or less access all the data, so you don't lose any information on the import. So what we do is we take the Word document, we import it into Polarium, where we have the engine that you can configure what is actually recognized as a requirement. Is it every paragraph? Is it every paragraph that contains the word should or must? Is it every paragraph with some special style? Whatever structure you follow, and then you enable this a continuous collaboration between the initial stakeholder who might be using Microsoft Word to gather the requirements and the development team. So we enable so-called round trip, that we can export the specification back to Word, you can modify it offline and import the changes back. But once again, the most essential goal of the gathering process is really to structure the unstructured data, the text blocks, the large text blocks, into something that is uniquely identifiable and traceable. When speaking about authoring process, because now it starts to be more, let's say, more complex, the authoring doesn't start from nowhere. I took this example from from European German car manufacturers, and I've been dealing with customers all over the world, and actually we have recognized that there is not really the right terminology in English language for that. So I'm using here this German terminology, even though I'm not speaking German. That's the concept of the Lastenheft and Pflichtenheft. So very often you might have the OEM company, someone who is specifying what needs to be done, and then the supplier delivers so-called Pflichtenheft, which is a description of how we will cover the initial needs. So it's really the specification of the initial requirements and maybe more the specification of the design requirements. So we can demonstrate this authoring process on an activity of authoring the design of my requirements. So I mean how I'm going to design my solution, what will I deliver as a result of the analysis of what needs to be done. And again, I mean, there are a couple of points that we highlight that are very important for this process of authoring the design specifications, and this is authoring in the context and almost automating the traceability or ensuring the traceability immediately. You might read in a title of this webinar that, I mean, we will cover also the way how to let's say deal with the agile requirements management. Don't be that much scared about how much I'm referring to the specifications. I really think that for complex systems you still need to manage some of the specifications, and I will explain why. So this is really more for the system engineering, so for embedded software development. So the example here about the authoring is that you can really see on the left the initial requirement specification that you get from the customer that you have imported from the Word document or from RecIF. And when I select the initial requirement and I go to so-called refinement mode, the authoring in the context means that whenever I'm writing the software design requirements or any kind of the design requirements, all the requirements will be automatically linked to the initial requirements. So we know that as the projects are getting more complex, and we speak really about projects with 100 million lines of code, really big software projects, you really handle a very large data. And what we are promoting is the concept of not ensuring the traceability as the afterthought, but really enable your users to, let's say, establish traceability as you author the data immediately. So instead of just writing my specification and then linking the initial and design requirements in the traceability metrics, ensure that when I have the system requirement and I define the software requirement, just because I'm doing it in the same system, it could be linked automatically. Of course, later, I mean, if you're saying that you speak more about the agile development and the change could happen anytime when the system requirement is being changed, I'll be notified instantly that I should adjust the design requirements through the suspect links or any kind of the mechanism. Why is it important? Why is it so important to really connect the functional requirements to the design solution requirements at the end? It's all really about impact analysis. So one thing is that we really focus on the projects with very large data. We speak about projects with 50,000 requirements, 20 million lines of code, and then if you really get the update to your initial requirements and you need to assess the possible impact from the functional safety point of view, from cost point of view, you really can do it in a much more reliable way if you see the system and design requirements connected. And it's not only about requirements. As I told you, I mean, it's very critical to keep the requirements in the context of the other artifacts like UML models, like the system models in MATLAB Simulink, or also with the actual source code. So if I get the change of the initial requirement, I can really see a trace down to the UML model or to the code and assess the impact on the system based on understanding all those pieces together. And of course, as it is in the one single interface, it is much easier than if you would need to search for it over the multiple systems. Approvals. You know, when you start speaking about approvals, everyone's thinks that this is kind of the old-fashioned waterfall approach with having really different stakeholders going through the sequential process. So you really first need to specify everything up front. There are reasons why the approval still makes sense even in today's highly agile environment. And this is mostly the functional safety needs. So for approvals, I believe that as we were speaking about traceability in the context, requirements in the context, the same should happen for approvals. What I'm saying is that you need to differentiate between sequential and parallel approvals. I will give you an example that you might go through the process that you you create a document, you push it into the draft status, you submit it to review. From review, you push it to review state, and from review to approved, from approved to completed. You see that you can really think about the full process regarding your requirement specification documents, but some of those errors are marked as red. So these are actually the cases when the people need to sign the actual transition. It means that the approval is not just, let's say, one phase of the requirement lifecycle, even though there could be a status called approved, but you really need to make sure that before it will actually even go for the final approval, some people will sign it or marked as reviewed. And here, many of our customers who are using Polarian to manage requirements for medical projects or aerospace projects, they really need to ensure that the specification can really go to production only if it was reviewed by a functional safety engineer, if it was reviewed from the architecture point of view, that the architecture was designed properly. And you can really need to specify really what are the conditions when the specification could be released for the final approval. So it could be released only if at least 2 engineers have reviewed it and none of them have disapproved the specification. You can really think about many different processes and many different possible flows how to design your process regarding requirements. In reality, what it means is that you also need to make it extremely user-friendly. If you really need to satisfy those regulatory requirements by FDA, by ISO 26262, we have seen many customers who are just like pretending to follow the process because it was extremely difficult to go through the formal procedure in the actual tool. We believe that we have found a right balance between the usability and enforcement, so-called control. So if I have my system requirements or software requirements, I cannot mark it as reviewed as long as Alex Seller and Robert Project, as you can see here, will mark a document as reviewed. Once they will perform the review in a very user-friendly interface, the owner of the specification can, let's say, go into the workflow and push it for the next status. So at the end, I have the full, let's say, summary on top of my requirements, who has signed it for review, who has signed it for approval. So that's also the part of the how we secure the collaboration over a given requirements document. And of course, everything is versioned, etc. We're speaking about the documents themselves, but actually the decision needs to be made also on which level do you actually approve or even manage the actual requirements. So do you really care only about the full specifications, or as I was promoting the granularity and individual items, how much important it is also to, let's say, approve the individual items? And that's typically depends on on the functional safety security level. So if you speak about automotive, these are the ASIL levels. Whether I am fine just to perform the approval on the requirement specification documents, or if I really need to approve every single individual requirement. And here we typically think about a push or pull schema. So, I mean, you can configure or decide whether you can mark a document as approved only if all the individual requirements have been marked as approved, or other way around, you can push the information from a document to the individual requirements. So I can ensure, I can simplify the process in a way that when I will mark a document as approved, all the requirements that are in the document in this given moment will get approved automatically. Managing of requirements. That's probably the most difficult question when speaking about managing requirements, is whether you will make the requirements stateful or stateless, and also to understand the difference between a requirement and a work package, where the work package could be a user story. I'll describe it in a minute. So what does it really mean, requirements to become stateless or stateful? There are basically two best practice or two options to set up the requirements management discipline, and this is really to make the requirements statuses not depending on the status of the implementation. So more or less, I mean, you have just a requirement active or inactive during the full effectivity period of a requirement. So this is very often practical if you need to implement multiple versions in parallel. So I have one requirement that can effectively be applied to two different streams that I need to develop in the same time. Then of course I couldn't mark the requirement as implemented because it could be implemented in a version A but not in the version B that are running in parallel. So if you really need to have the parallel development, we always try to push for the stateless requirements, whereas the stateful requirements means that you track also the status like done or implemented, rejected, verified as done, so you really also track the status of the quality assurance process. This is what we call a stateful requirements. I'll show later that we are more and more pushing as best practice the stateless approach because it is also more, let's say, aligned with the Agile approach. What does it really mean? So if I go with a stateless approach, where do I actually track the status of the production or implementation? That's what we call a work package or high-level task, or in an Agile process we call it a user story. So what we are saying is we are introducing a new type. Here on the screen you can see the work package that really defines an activity to deliver some of the requirements for a specific version. So in an example that I mentioned, that I have two versions A and B running in parallel, and there is one requirement that should be applied to both versions. I will have two work packages if these are two different teams, for example, one to implement the requirement in the version A and the other to implement the requirement in the version B. And of course the work package could relate to multiple requirements. And one of the typical implementation of a work package is the Agile user story concept. So speaking about work packages, about the user stories, what's so different comparing to requirements? So the first thing is definitely the structure. So the user stories or work packages, the reason why they exist are is to drive a development process. So you define the stories really to drive the teams to or to describe the increments. So they describe really what will be added into the product over a sprint. So they are really flat because you don't want to really have the dependencies. They describe the increments, and you define them in a way that they are feasible to implement and they are estimation ready. And the point here is that we believe it's very tough to actually gather the stories from nowhere. So that's why we recommend to start with a requirements gathering process, where requirements different to the user stories are very easy to write. It means that it doesn't mean that you need to specify all the stuff up front, but it's still better, to ask all the stakeholders to provide the initial requirements, where the requirements different to the user story are heavily overlapping. So it's not the flat structure, well ordered, but it's really a structure specification with requirements and sub-requirements. They are not ordered. They could be prioritized, so I can say that some requirement is more important than the other, but you cannot really ensure that the ordering. Why not? Because they are also overlapping, and they are, they vary by size, and you could really in a very difficult way to really ensure the actual ordering. So in reality, you need to develop the backlog of user stories or backlog of work packages, and as an input, you might get, some business documents, but you also get this epic requirement specification documents, and you really again have a traceability from the requirements into the user stories or work packages. So at the end, you want to ensure that everything what you gather at the beginning is somehow covered by the user stories. But in the same time, if you really speak about those complex software projects with millions lines of code, we see that you need to have also the component specification documents. What I mean by that, just imagine that you need also to have to follow some non-functional accessibility requirements for, let's say, disabled people. So this is really something that you cannot really track in the story, because the story describes the increment, and the story doesn't really help you to find out what was implemented in the past. A simple example, you might have a functionality of a login screen, and you will have a first story to implement the login screen. You might have the acceptance criteria that there should be a login button, and this login button will be blue. After a while, you will recognize that the contrast is not enough, so you would like to make the button red. So you will have another story to actually modify the system, and after a while you will recognize that the red color is not a proper color, and you would like to use the blue color. So you will see that you have three tasks that actually are changing the functionality, and to understand how is the system working today, you would need to go through all the tasks to understand the system behavior. So that's why we typically introduce the term of a component specification, and if we extend the acceptance criteria over sprint, not just to deliver the potentially shippable product and update to the test procedures, so make sure that whatever you implemented in the user stories is now covered by the test procedures, by automated test cases, but the essential goal of a sprint is also to ensure that the component specifications are up to date. So if you go back to user story and requirements, one of the very principal difference between the user story and the requirement is that when the user story is done, you can almost delete it. Of course, you don't delete it because from the auditability perspective, but there is very little value in the stories that were already marked as done. On the other hand, the requirements is really something that stays active over the full life cycle of your project. So that's the stateless concept, that I don't mark the requirement as done. I just keep it active as long as this requirement stays valid for my product. So that's also very fundamental difference in a life cycle. Speaking about management of requirements, I will end up the story here with a change management. The change management is something which is underestimated. I mean, and we believe that it's always important to ask, how do you enable the change management over your requirements? And we have one of the concept that might sound crazy to you, and this is really the concept of not changing the individual requirements. So what does it really mean? So imagine that you have the specification for the initial version of your software or product, where we have some of the requirements about the passwords, like that the password must be validated when the user wants to change it. It must contain at least one number. It must contain at least 8 characters. And there are also some requirements for the login screen that, for example, when the password doesn't match, the system should wait 3 seconds before the user can try to log in for the next time. So I really have the system working. I've released the version 1.0, and there is a change request. The change request describes the need from the business to extend the security constraints based on some standard, hypothetical standard here. And I can gather the actual expectation that based on this standard, we would need to change the login process, so at least there is at least one non-ASCII character in the password, and if the login fails, the next login should happen after 15 minutes. So we have the initial requirements, we have the specification, and we have the change request. So what do we really mean but not changing the requirements? The point is that when you start working on the next major version of your system, what we typically promote is a concept of branching not just your code, but also branching your requirement specification documents. And when I branch my specification, I don't really create a copy. It's similar to some version control management system. When you branch the requirements in Polarium, you create another document, another container, but the container just refers to the same individual requirements. So branching means no copying. So when I really just create my specification for version 2.0, I have the same set of requirements, the same individual objects. And then I can add a requirement in this specification. So here you can really see that we add this yellow requirement, password must contain at least one non-ASCII character. It means that by saying you don't change the requirements, what we see is if you really keep your requirements granular, it means that if your requirement is not a large chapter in a document, or if this is not a big epic item, if you really keep every information separate, you typically don't need to change them, as most of the time you just add another requirement into the set. And of course, it might happen that we would really need to change the individual objects. Like here in the past, we let the system wait 3 seconds, but as you remember the change request, we need to really now change it from 3 seconds to 15 minutes. And that's actually what we say, is that instead of changing the requirements, we enable users easily to just so-called override the requirement, which replace the old reference with a really new requirement. So when saying we don't recommend our customers to change the requirements, what we are saying is don't change the requirement if the behavior of the system with respect to this information needs to be changed. because there could be already a testing procedure assigned to the old version. More or less what we are saying is that make the old requirement obsolete and create a new requirement that represent the new functionality. So at the end, I have the full traceability from the change request that says about extending the security constraints to the requirements that were affected. Most of the time there are new requirements. Some of the time it's always actually a new requirement, because if you really need to change something, it means we add a new requirement which replaces another one. So if I need to implement a functionality, I create a new work package or user story to implement the functionality. Here I have the traceability that I need to implement a story to prevent brute force login attack. So I will change this 15 minutes delay. Or I really need to set up a new test cases to match the new requirements. So with this approach, you can really always measure the test coverage. You can measure the progress over your implementation, and that's really one of the biggest reasons why we recommend these stateless objects and highly granular requirements. And again, one of the fundamental enablement of having the requirements granular is the user interface that really enables you to easily structure your requirements like that. It would take 15 clicks to create a new requirement. Of course, you could hardly, let's say, train your users or guide your users about having every piece of the information tracked as individual items. But if it is really straightforward, like creating a new paragraph, so instantly when I create a new paragraph, it becomes a traceable entity, then you can really ensure in your change management process that you more or less do not change the individual requirements. So that's it. That's what we typically consider as a basic principles behind gathering, authoring, and approval process over the requirements management. And so hopefully we have sometimes now 15 minutes to go through the possible questions. We'll open the panel. Is the author process related to requirements or design? Actually, that's a good question, especially because what do we really call by requirement? You probably might be aware of the concept called test first. So in some of the Agile methodologies, they promote the concept of writing the test before anything could be actually tested, because nothing is really written. And what we often recommend as extension to this test first approach is actually an approach that the requirement might be really written as part of the implementation. So for us, the most important thing about requirements is not that they specify upfront what needs to be done, but the most important goal of a requirement is to ensure the consistency. So when I have developed something, I can define the requirements for the future adjustments of my system. So you can consider that for the initial implementation, I might be fine with a concept of the user story, because this really describes what needs to be done. But the component specification collects the essential requirements and criteria that any time I'll need to design something in the future, I will need to adjust something, I have a specification where I learn how the system is working today and what are the requirements that needs to be kept and maintained for the future. So what we are saying is that don't consider the term requirement just as something that needs to be developed before you start the actual implementation, so that drives what will be delivered, but also as something that is applicable through the full life cycle over your project, and then ensures the consistency over the through the full life cycle of your project. So when you speak really about the design, for the design, I mean we combine the modeling capabilities with the requirements management. So we typically, I mean, recommend the customers to combine some of the modeling approaches with the textual requirements, because we believe that today it might be too time-consuming, or it's not really efficient to track everything related to the design as through the model or architecture, but you really need also to have some complementary specifications. So when I was speaking about the authoring, I gave you an example of authoring the design requirements, but of course it could apply to author the initial requirements based on the business cases or the change management coming from a customers. Does Explorer have tools for use case editor, process flows, and mockups? Yes, we do have the tools for also, let's say, maintaining not just the textual requirements, but more the graphical requirements. I would say here that we provide the tools, but as we were focusing on the requirements management today, I try to stay focused on the pure textual requirements, and we also do integrate with some of the popular tools here, like I was speaking about the UML, so we integrate with Enterprise Architect. I was speaking about the SysML, so we integrate with MATLAB Simulink. So on one side, yes, we bundle some of the tools with the system, but we also integrate with the others. In the context of component specification requirements, does it mean that if you develop user stories, we still develop requirements for those that cannot go to a user story? I did some webinars before about the Agile processes. What I like on the user story is that the user story is a great artifact to drive an activity. So I mean, it explains the development teams why they should do something, what is really the motivation. Saying that you also write down those requirements as a complementary artifacts to the stories, I think this is very important for projects that are more complex, where, as I said, when you mark the user story as done, you typically can almost delete it, because no one can let's say find out what the system should do or what is the system behavior based on the story, because there are so many of them that they describe the dynamics but not the current state of the project. So yes, for the complex projects, what is a complex project? I mean, probably the starting point could be 5 teams working on the same product, somewhere around 500,000 lines of code, really some level of complexity that, or maybe a lifetime. So if you really need to maintain your product over more than 2 2 years, so you know that you will maintain the code base over a period of time, then the user stories are not enough as a holder of the information how to keep the system consistent. So the requirements, don't consider requirements just as a waterfall approach to specify what will be done, but try to think more about them as a conditions, what should be kept in the product. And of course, the essential question might be, what is the difference then between a requirement and a test case? The problem of a test case is that very often the test cases are checking different conditions, but they are not so easy to read, to understand upfront when I perform impact analysis, what I need to do. So the test cases will guarantee that whatever I changed, I haven't broken anything, but they don't really help you to do an analysis upfront. What will be probably the cost? What should we do concerning the risk analysis? So how should we really assess the possible hazards and risks? So unfortunately, as you need to really to maintain the test procedures, you might need to maintain the requirements to maintain the consistency of your project. Does the tool produce Word documents to be archived in a document management system? Yes, that's very common, especially for example, the medical device development. I mean, there are lots of regulatory requirements to really keep the requirement specifications archived. We produce the Word and PDF documents that could be really versioned. So from any document, I can go directly back to the system to the exact same version of a document as it was when you have exported it into the PDF. Does the Polarn have a ASIC feature that is approved for FDA use? Yes, we provide the electronic signatures based on FDA standards. So this is CFR 21 Part 11, which yeah, it's a standard about electronic signatures, where again the electronic signatures do not speak only about the approvals, but about let's say significant actions. So we also provide electronic signatures also for verification of the requirements. So when I execute the final verification through test cases, I also need to electronically sign the requirements. There are some competitive questions regarding some of our competitors. I don't want to answer it here. If you would please contact us and we can handle it offline. Some of the questions are really quite complex. Does this tool support RecIF? Yes, we do support RecIF and RIF. It's a great standard to exchange data first between the vendor and supplier. So I mean, it's an offline or it's a document-based exchange format, so you can really exchange requirements between different organizations, and of course it could be also used to exchange data between different requirements management solutions. It has been standardized pretty well. Unfortunately, there are minor, I mean, the standard is not well adopted by all the vendors, so you might see some of the problems concerning what version of the software used. But yes, we do support RecIF and RIF. So you say you do not change the entire document, but add the change as a 2.0 of the document. If you change the initial requirement, how will it be known that the change was made if you delete the original requirement? Or does it matter for a change was made? So in my example, what I've presented is that I added a new requirement. Of course, if I added a new requirement, I trigger the workflow process. So it goes to the draft state, and I can go through the. So first, if I create this branch 2.0, this container, the branch itself has an associated lifecycle, has a workflow. So I would first need, if I need, to go through the workflow of the specification 2.0. I can mark this new document as approved only if all the requirements inside of this document has been approved. It means that if I added new of them, the new requirements has to be approved. The old one, as they were the references to the previous version, are already approved. So the system is actually tracking the track what really needs to be reapproved. That's really the formal part if you really need to be, for example, FDA compliant. If you speak more about really notifications and agility, of course, if you add a new requirement, you might be notified via email, you might get it on your personal dashboard. When I was changing this requirement from 15 seconds to 2 minutes, that's again, as you override it, you again create a new requirement, so you'll be notified. So yes, you have the notifications, but you have not just notifications, but you have also the guidance through the workflow. So it means that if I have at least some stage approach that I, for example, would like to make sure that this 2.0 version is really approved, I do it because my container 2.0 version is being really in the status draft or in review or whatever. So you really have the workflow on both the container and on the requirement itself. And you can really minimize the effort to stay concentrated only on the changes, because you know what was already approved before, because these are the old items. Can you suggest the best requirements tool, light, slim version for small projects? I think that the concept that I think is really important, and I don't want to, recommend any competitor, but what I would really focus on, try to find a tool where your requirements stays as a granular, small object. So whenever you think about just creating like wiki pages or creating, let's say, big objects like epics that contains just the paragraphs, as long as you really cannot trace the individual elements of the specification or description, then I think that that's not a proper requirements management tool. So, the requirement number one from my point of view would be, please try to always, let's say, assess if you are able to not just trace the chapters of a document, but you can really trace the individual lines and how easy it is to create those individual objects. There is a story that says that the user stories are a bit too big for data projects and talk about developer stories instead, which may not necessarily work out to the user demo. Would your system support that? So anyway, I agree with the fact that the user stories are the artifacts primarily written for development teams. So I have been working on the projects in the past where the dev teams were lacking the information about why they are doing something, about they were building products that were not matching the initial requirements because they didn't get the initial understanding of a problem domain. They get already specification of a solution, which is really wrong. So yes, I agree that let's say the most important thing is to define a task that contains the user story. So what I think is wrong is to consider the user story as an initial requirement from a customer, because those stories are typically too big, and you need to break them down into the small, feasible to implement items. But once you break them down into those small chunks, they become less usable for the external communication to the customer, because they will tell you, hey, I mean, guys, this is too small. I mean, I need the full picture. I need the full feature. I'm not. I mean, why do you break it down to such a small pieces? So that's really the case. That yes, I mean, there is a difference between a customer request, where you should always have the story statement behind that, but the user stories in the traditional Agile process, I think that really the product owner is responsible to translate the customer needs into the user stories that are feasible to implement. So it could be really, let's say, focused on the capabilities of a development team. Stateless in your case seem to be referring to moving the status from the requirement instance itself to the fact of the requirement being used with a particular project, rather than talking about stateless. Maybe yes, I understand where the confusion might come from. So maybe you should think about considering the requirement is a lot about the content, so the statement, the statement what the system should do, and the state of the requirement should reflect the status of this statement. So is this still applicable? So should I mean, is this really already let's say agreed that yes, the system should behave like that, or is it still valid? So do we still need to keep this requirement in the system? If not, you can make it obsolete. So that's a state related only to a statement of a requirement, where the stateful in the old-fashioned way was more like really to mark, to assign the long-term lifecycle workflow with an object, like is this requirement implemented? Is it verified? Was it, let's say, deployed already into the SaaS environment? And this is really something that if you make them really so state-rich, you will have problems with the parallel development, and especially, I mean, now, I mean, you would, it's not very practical. So maybe the stateless and stateful terminology is not really the right one. We see a lot of other questions. Unfortunately, we run out of time. I really appreciate all the questions. It was a pleasure to answer them. We will try to follow up offline through them. So, I mean, we'll get your contacts, and we'll answer the questions I haven't answered today offline via email. Thank you once again.
Yuri, thank you so much. Can you just move your slide to the last screen? And thank you so much, Yuri, for such a great webinar today. And we'd like to thank Siemens Industry Sponsor for sponsoring today's event as well. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone that today's webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few business days. This concludes today's event, and have a great day. Thank you.